Edges remember heat longer than the face.
Like people.
I am too old for you, she whispered. Cowboy kissed her softly. Then let me be young enough. The first shot shattered morning the way a hammer splits thin ice, clean, shocking, and gone too fast to be believed. The Jornada del Muerto took the echo and swallowed it, leaving behind the glassy hum of heat that made every rock seem to breathe. Evelyn Hart crouched behind a stagecoach wheel cracked through the spokes, her corset biting until breath turned thin and ribboned. Sweat made a map at her temples. Alkali dust salted the corners of her lips. She had imagined the West as a grand painting sky like an organ hymn, mesas like folded psalms, but in truth the light was a blade, and the ground a grater, and refinement bled out quick upon it. One mule screamed the sharp, unhuman sound that makes the heart choose its side, and then the scream fell off the edge of the world. The driver lay on his back among rabbit brush, hat rolled away like a dropped moon. A passenger bolted sideways into the glare, smaller and smaller until the heat took him whole. A rope of wind tugged at the coach lashes and set a tin latch rattling, a lonely, foolish sound, as if asking civilization to come back and close itself properly. She tried to count herself calm the way her Philadelphia doctor taught the careful square of 4 inhale, hold, exhale, hold, but all the numbers had sand in them. A splinter in the rim grazed her gloved palm. The glove looked tragic and brave, which would have amused her yesterday. A rider came over the low rise, as if the desert had drawn him with a ruler. He slid off his dun horse with knees bent, careful in the way of men who have paid too often for clumsiness. Hat brim dipped, jaw dark with the day's beginning. He did not speak first. He listened, shoulders angled to the wind, head tilted for small information, the whisper of a loose stirrup, the far ping of metal against stone. Only when the silence told him it would hold did he turn to her. "Keep your head down, ma'am," he said, voice low as oiled boot leather. His pistol barked twice, not angry, only decisive, and a rider across the wash thought better of his options, hauled his pony south, and became an intention that never quite happened. The stranger holstered with the care of a man shelving a tool he respects. He studied Evelyn's shoes, city narrow, heels chewed by alkali, studied the rip at her hem where blood had kissed the cloth when the coach toppled, saw the tremor in her jaw when she tried to stand. He took it all in like a blacksmith testing a bar, feeling the spring, measuring the truth. "Name's Colt Ramirez," he said. "Town's 3 miles yonder if you cut the glare right. You ain't walking that in those shoes." "Oh." Evelyn wanted to say she had managed worse, that Philadelphia winters teach a woman how to move through cruelty without fuss, but the sentence snagged on a thorny mix of pride and desperation and came out smaller than she liked. "Thank you," she said. The word tasted like tin. He nodded, which was all the conversation the sun permitted. Up close, he looked younger than his stillness, 20-something by the math, late 30 by the miles in his eyes, and his face carried a pale knife of a scar along the jaw, like an old argument settled without agreement. He tilted the canteen toward her. "Small sips. Water teaches manners out here." She obeyed. Warm metal wet her mouth, ran to the back of her throat, and came back down as courage. Some part of her that had been rehearsing for death canceled its performance. He put 2 fingers to the mule's neck, the way a man checks a child's fever, then used the same 2 fingers to nudge the broken pole clear of a wheel. The country watched him and made no comment. When he offered his arm, she took it because the world was insisting she do the practical thing. He lifted her easy as a cracked violin lifted to the chin, careful of splinters, careful of dignity. The dun horse blew smoke. By the soot bloom along his shoulder accepted their doubled weight with one ear cocked back in consultation. Colt's arm steadied at her waist, not bold, merely present. The saddle leather warmed the air. The alkali flats threw knife, light. Heat got in everywhere, language could not reach. They moved. 200 words pass. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. He rode with his hips and knees, reins loose as forgiveness, letting the horse decide which patches of world would hold. Every 5th stride he glanced toward the faint shimmer that meant wet. Every 10th stride he glanced at Evelyn's hands where they clutched the horn. and when her knuckles thinned to marble, he flattened his palm over hers for the length of one breath and then went away again, the way good help does. "Where's your party?" he asked at last. "Scattered," she said. It wasn't untrue. A scatter can be caused by bullets, or by panic, or by providence. This morning seemed happy to use all three. "You from the city?" "Philadelphia," she said, "because at such moments truth is the only swagger left to you." "Then you know about hard winters," he said. "Out here, the winter's inside the Sunday." She surprised herself by laughing one small bark, not elegant, very alive. He let the corner of his mouth admit it had seen a joke pass by. The land tilted them toward a crease where cottonwoods were pretending to be saints and not quite convincing anyone. A thin thread of water unrolled itself among stones. Colt slid down first and took Evelyn at the elbows, the way a man catches a plate that's worth more than the meal on it. She swayed. He steadied. He stepped back only when it would not look like abandonment. "Sit." He brought his hat brim to the creek and poured the cold across her wrists. "Don't chase what you can't change before noon." She closed her eyes and let the world reassemble behind them. When she opened them, the stranger was refilling the canteen with the solemnity of a vow. He gave her the second drink. It tasted less like tin. It tasted like a tomorrow that might come if asked politely. "You have a mother somewhere to write," he said, not prying, only giving her a handle. "They're dead," she said. "Both." The pronoun felt old and practiced and still raw. He nodded in the way men do when they recognize a map, because they walked it once. "Then we'll write each other," he said, which could have been flirtation from anyone else, and here was simply a plan. He watered blue smoke and checked the horse's front near shoe with the ease of muscle memory. His fingers tested the nail clinches. Quick, precise, affectionate. "I shoe in town," he added, as if he were excusing the intimacy of touching his horse's foot in front of a lady. "Liveries mine afternoons, forge mornings. Scout work sometimes when the army misplaces itself." "Lie." Evelyn studied the way he moved, the handy economy of it, the way he gave each task exactly as much attention as it deserved, and no more, as if waste were not merely a sin but an embarrassment. In Philadelphia, men wasted time in parlors with talk. Out here, a wasted minute could undo a day of doing. She found her feet again, accepted his arm again, found the saddle again. The creek let them go with a series of tiny silver sounds, like coins of mercy clinking in a jar. The ground rose gently, and then sudden as a confession the town. Last Water Junction was no painting. It had the grace not to pretend. The livery was black with the breath of horses. The smithy's mouth glowed orange, alive with a hunger that turned iron into something neighborly. A clapboard store sold hope and flour in equal measure. The church leaned, but who among us does not? Children discovered their own shadows and chased them in the dust, as if laughter were new and needed testing. Faces turned, measured, sorted, softened a whole civics lesson in half a minute. Colt guided blue smoke to the boarding house, whose porch wore a quilt of hand-sanded plank and a rocker that had outlived heartbreaks. The woman who owned it stood in the doorway, arms folded, hair pinned in a way that suggested no argument could outlast her. She took Evelyn in with one look dust, torn ribbon, the courage that lives behind good posture, and stepped aside. "Room's aired," she said. "Stove keeps secrets. You come in." Colt dismounted and lifted Evelyn down as if lowering a book he meant to finish later. He did not follow her up the steps. "I'll be at the forge," he said. "Bring the dust if it tries to keep you." "What do I owe you?" she asked, because owing the right amount is the last dignity pride knows. He cocked his head, decided she was serious, answered in kind. "Owe me your breath back. That'll be plenty." Lo! He stood in the street a breath longer than a man with work ought to, and then turned toward the anvil, where metal waited to be told what shape to hold. The boarding house had the human noises that pull a person back from the cliff. A kettle negotiated with itself. Somewhere, a floorboard made the little confession it had made for 20 years. Through the window, the sky leaned in like a friend. Mrs. Valdez, so introduced in a hallway that smelled of soap, set a basin down and did the brisk kindnesses. A cloth pressed to Evelyn's temples, a cool hand to her cheek, a fresh dress borrowed from a niece who had married and outgrown her first dreams. The borrowed calico was faded to gentleness. The seams understood that a woman has a shape and a history. Rest, Mrs. Valdez said. Then soup. Soup before thinking. Evelyn obeyed the order of operations because it sounded like salvation disguised as common sense. She slept past the noisy blue of afternoon into the quiet gold at its back, and woke to the sound of iron ringing, measured, patient, exact. The door stood open to the porch. Heat lay down in long sheets, tired and gorgeous. From the rocker she could see the smithy's rectangle alive with a small universe of sparks. Colt's silhouette moved inside the glow hammer, lifted and set the old liturgy of heat and angle and gift. He did not look up, and somehow that was exactly what made her feel seen. Children gathered at the porch rail with the serious curiosity of citizens. 2 railroad boys, a girl with braids, a Navajo lad with eyes like coal wet from rain who stayed partly in shadow as if to give the town a chance to prove itself. They watched the hammer ring and counted all of them without deciding to 1 to 12, and then again, because you count rhythms when you're learning your world. Is it always like that? One boy asked, pointing his chin at the smithy. Like what? Evelyn said, surprised to hear her voice in its better register. Like the sound knows where it's going. She considered. Good work always sounds like that, she said, and realized she was telling herself a thing as much as them. She fetched a slate from the mantel where someone had kept it for remembering debts, brushed the chalk dust with her palm, and wrote a letter A so big it had weather. The children leaned forward. She drew E and L and M and W names, beginnings, pieces of their own living, then wrote water, then home. Then, after a hesitation, she allowed, enough. The Navajo boy stepped 1 board nearer without meaning to. Evelyn pretended not to see the bravery. She taught toward it instead, which is the better way. She sounded the letters and let them echo under the smith's ringing, and somewhere in the matching of those 2 sounds, a hammer making shape, a teacher making sense, a town found its better idea of itself. When Mrs. Valdez set a jar of lemonade on the rail, a little more mercy than sugar, Evelyn asked if she might carry it to the forge, which was perhaps not done, but then, much that must be done in a new life, wasn't. Colt quenched a crescent of iron and set the tongs aside only when the hiss had finished telling its truth. She offered the jar. He took it without looking away from the orange mouth of the coal, then finally did look. The glance was quick, respectful, reading her face like a farrier reading a hoof, checking for cracks, heat, tenderness. Edges remember heat longer than the face, he said, nodding at the bent iron that would become a shoe. Like people, she answered. He tipped the jar in apology to the day, swallowed, handed it back. News runs faster than horses out here, he said, checking a gauge only he could see. Some say you're a teacher. Some say you're trouble from a city that makes fancier kinds of trouble. What do you say? She asked, steadying the jar with hands that were steadier for the asking. I say the desert doesn't mind what we were named before we got here. He set the iron on the anvil, took a heat with his eyes alone, and struck 3 times the sound exact as the way prayer feels on the 1 night a year, you mean it. She could have told him everything then, the letter that nailed her to a wall, the headmaster's son with his oily smile, the corridor of whispers that could pass through oak, and she nearly did. But timing is the first craft learned in a world that rings, and she was not about to rush the one grace the day had proven it possessed. Patience. She left the lemonade jar and crossed back to the boarding house porch and wrote mercy on the slate. Beneath it she wrote work. The children copied the letters in the air with their forefingers, solemn as a congregation. By the time dusk became lawful, the forge cooled its hunger to a low red. Colt dipped his hammerhead in the slack tub and set it ready for the morning that would need it. The town came to a gentle end, the way good sentences do, not with exclamation, but with a clarity that makes you glad for silence. Evelyn stood at the porch rail, a borrowed shawl collecting the last crumbs of light. Colt's shadow lengthened in the smithy door. He did not step into the street toward her. There are economies out here, not all of them about money, but his stillness set itself so that if she glanced that way, she would see someone had decided to be nearby. She did glance. She did see. She lifted her hand, a small motion that in another life would have been a fan flutter, and here felt almost like a vote. He touched his hat brim. In a salute so simple, it turned ceremonial. "Good night," she said to the town because the town had earned it. The town, being a town, said nothing, but it held the moment and kept it safe, which is the best reply. Toward midnight the wind woke. It shouldered at the window and talked at the eaves in a language roofs have learned to understand. Evelyn lay on a narrow bed that did not know her, and let the sounds take attendance. The midnight freight clanking where track meets stubborn, a coyote delivering his report to no one, the forge cooling with small clicks like the day unbuttoning itself. Sleep came as if it had been waiting in the chair. She dreamt of the alphabet walking itself into words, and the words opening like doors, and behind the doors, a classroom with a bell, so honest, the air turned clean. When she woke, the sky had begun its slow, pale, and a rooster practicing faith took up a foolish argument with the dawn, and, against the odds, won. Morning lit the town the right way sideways, forgiving. Colt crossed the street with a board on his shoulder and the exact gait of a man who knows he can make a thing exist. He set the board against the boarding house rail without knocking, without saying, "I brought this for benches," which meant, of course, that he had. He marked a line with his thumb where a saw would later agree, then left the board there like a promise that didn't need witnesses. Evelyn pressed her palm flat to the plank's grain and felt the faint warmth the morning had loaned it. She realized, not for the first time, that beginnings are a kind of weather arriving, changing everything, leaving you to choose your coat. The bell of the day rang out, not the church bell, not yet any school's, just the smithy's first strike, metal answering metal, a bright, corrected note. And under it, softer, nearly shy, another bell sounded. The little tin one someone had set on the boarding house table, struck by the knuckle of a child who believed in time. Evelyn smiled, and in that private motion was a declaration. She would not be returned to a past written by other hands. Not today. Maybe not ever again. She lifted the slate. She drew today. She underlined it once, then twice. Then she walked to the porch edge and waited for the small congregation that would choose, like her, to begin. By the time the sun folded itself down behind the bluffs, Last Water Junction had the color of old brass. The wind lost its sharp edge and began to talk instead of bite. From the boarding house porch, Evelyn could see the slow smoke of the smithy twining upward like a scripture written for the sky alone. Mrs. Valdez's kitchen smelled of stew thick with mercy beans, onion, a cautious hand of chili. The older woman ladled a bowl and set it on the small pine table without ceremony. "Eat, tomorrow starts too soon out here." Evelyn obeyed, though her hands still trembled from the day's ride. The spoon clinked softly against the bowl. Every sound seemed new, amplified by the strangeness of being alive when she hadn't expected to be. When she finally looked up, Mrs. Valdez was studying her with the clear eyes of someone who had outlived a war and 2 husbands. "You got folks coming?" "No," Evelyn said. "Then you got this room. The roof leaks honest, but it leaks slow. You'll like that." A laugh caught Evelyn off guard. "I think I already do." After supper she washed the bowl herself, because it felt wrong not to. The water in the basin was cool, the soap harsh, the small act of usefulness unexpectedly consoling. Through the window she could see sparks jumping in Colt Ramirez's forge, each one a brief confession of fire before it turned to nothing. The rhythm of hammer against iron filled the street, steady and unhurried, like a heartbeat that had decided to trust the world again. She watched longer than she meant to, until the hammering stopped and a hush arrived, thick as velvet. The forge went dark except for one small coal still insisting on its right to glow. Evelyn took that glow upstairs with her, tucked beneath her ribs. The room held the ordinary things that save people: a chair, missing a rung, a dresser polished by decades of unremarkable hands, a quilt patched with equal parts thread and faith. She unpinned her hair, letting the dust fall with it. The mirror gave back a face she knew and didn't. Streaked, tired, the eyes too alive for despair. Sleep came in slices. In one, she was running again through the corridors of her old school, letters of accusation fluttering like white birds against the blackboards. In another, she stood on a platform as snow made every goodbye clean. and in the last, she heard the anvil's ringing turn into a bell summoning children, and she woke with tears drying cool on her temples. Morning began with a rooster that couldn't hold a tune but had conviction enough for both of them. Evelyn pulled on the borrowed calico and stepped onto the porch. Air so dry it crackled met her face. Across the way, Colt stood before the forge shirt-sleeved, shoulders moving in a deliberate dance with the hammer. Each stroke sent a note into the morning, clear, slow, purposeful. He looked up once, just long enough to see her standing there, then nodded a greeting that was as much permission as politeness. She raised a hand in answer. Words seemed unnecessary in a place where everything meaningful was already making noise. Children began to appear like wildflowers after rain, a boy with mismatched boots, a girl carrying her brother, the Navajo child who hovered at the fence pretending he wasn't interested. They watched Colt work, counted each blow under their breath, and laughed when the rhythm tricked them. Evelyn found herself smiling. Without thinking, she went inside for a slate and a stub of chalk left near the register. On the porch step she drew a single letter, A, large enough to catch light. The boy in mismatched boots leaned forward. "That an ox?" "A letter," she said. "It pulls a different kind of plow." He blinked, then grinned as if he had just been invited into a secret. She wrote B, then C, and under it water. Somewhere behind her the hammer paused, then resumed in gentler rhythm, keeping time with her chalk. When noon burned straight overhead, Mrs. Valdez appeared with a jar of lemonade that sweated honesty down its sides. "For the forge," she said. Evelyn offered to carry it. The smithy smelled of iron and effort. Colt was fitting a shoe, the horse patient and wise. He looked up when the lemonade shadow fell across his bench. "Thank you," he said, voice rough from heat. "Edges remember heat longer than faces." "Like people," she replied. He gave the faintest smile. "You learn fast." She handed him the jar, watching how his fingers, scarred and sure, curved around the glass. The movement was deliberate, respectful, as if he feared to leave fingerprints where comfort should stay clean. "Children were watching you," she said. "They like the music of your work." "Good. Better they hear something honest early." "That." He drank, wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. "You plan to teach them?" "If the town lets me." He looked at her then, directly. "The town lets what proves useful." The words could have stung. Instead, they steadied her. "I can prove that," she said. "I expect you will." He turned back to the forge, placed another bar in the coals, and for a moment she saw not just the blacksmith but the soldier he had once been, a man translating guilt into craft, noise into order. She left before the silence between them became something that needed naming. Outside, the children waited with questions she hadn't thought to prepare for. So she taught them the alphabet of the town. B for bell, F for forge, H for heart, D for dust that carried both ruin and seed. By the time the sun slid low again, her skirt was powdered white, her fingers ghosted with chalk, and her voice hoarse from speaking truths too small for sermons, yet large enough to build a life on. The day's last hammer strike landed like a punctuation mark. She looked toward the forge, saw Colt hanging his apron on a peg, shoulders slack in the tired grace of honest work. He glanced across, met her eyes, and this time the nod carried something else: acknowledgement, maybe gratitude, maybe the start of a story neither of them was ready to title. That evening the town gathered in small, habitual ways. Lamps winked on behind thin curtains, dogs debated philosophy along the main road, and the smell of coffee threaded itself through the dust. Evelyn sat on the porch rail with her notebook open across her knees, copying down the children's names before sleep could steal them. Writing each one felt like planting: Abe Martinez, Clara James, John Two Feathers, the first alphabet of belonging. Down the street, Colt's forge breathed like a heart too proud to rest. He worked later than the others, the flare of his bellows lighting and fading against the far wall. Between strikes he hummed something wordless that might have been a hymn or a memory. When he quenched the iron, steam rose and curled into the dark like prayers unsure of their destination. Evelyn watched until the hammer went silent. A thought simple, treacherous, entered her mind. No man ever worked so quietly in Philadelphia. The city's men had built their noises into armor. Colt's silence was different. It wasn't emptiness but confidence. She closed the notebook to keep the thought from growing too loud. Inside, Mrs. Valdez was stitching by lamplight. "You're teaching again tomorrow? If they come, they'll come. Children trust what listens back. And the grown ones?" The older woman gave a little shrug. "Grown ones need time. You can't bake bread in thunder." Evelyn smiled. "You have a proverb for everything." "I have burns from both ovens, Mrs. Valdez said, and tied off her thread. Sleep came easier that night, carried on the hum of crickets and the honest fatigue of having earned a place, however small. When dawn broke pink as a confession, the town smelled of coal smoke and wet wood. She dressed quickly, braided her hair, and stepped outside into a world already half awake. Colt was at the pump, drawing water into a tin pail. He offered a brief nod. The morning didn't need more. She caught the glint of wet on his forearms and looked away, startled by her own interest. "You building something new?" she asked. "Benches," he said. "Small ones, easier than desks, easier to move when life changes its mind. For the school? For whatever the school becomes." He hoisted the pail and turned toward the forge. She wanted to follow, to thank him, but the words felt too fragile under the weight of his steadiness, so she picked up the chalk instead. By mid-morning, her porch was alive with small hands. She had written river, sun, and bread across the board. The children traced each word in the dust at their feet. The Navajo boy, still half hiding behind the post, whispered the letters under his breath as if they were spells. Evelyn caught his eye and smiled without insisting he join. Some invitations must remain open doors, not command. At noon, the hammer from the forge slowed, then stopped. Colt crossed the street with a bucket of fresh water. "They'll dry out before you do," he said, gesturing at the children. "Then you're hired as rain," she answered. He grinned quick, crooked, reluctant. The children stared. Adults rarely smiled that honestly. "Miss Hart," one girl asked, "is he your husband?" Evelyn froze, then laughed, the sound brittle and warm at once. "No, child, he's the town's blacksmith." The girl considered this. "But he brings you water." "Oh, that's what decent men do," Colt said, tipping the bucket so the sunlight broke into coins around them. When the children scattered homeward, the porch sagged into its quiet again. Evelyn sat, brushing chalk dust from her skirt. Colt lingered on the step below, the space between them filled with the smell of iron and lemon. "Your class," he said, "sounds like a hive. Too much noise. Not enough sting." She laughed. "You'd be surprised what stings when a child learns his first word." "Oh." He looked at her then, really looked, as though memorizing a fact he hadn't known he'd need. "I believe that," he said softly. The afternoon slid by in shades of copper. Evelyn helped Mrs. Valdez knead bread, the dough warm under her fingers, the rhythm strangely akin to the forge's pulse. She told the older woman about the benches Colt was building, about the Navajo boy who spelled home correctly on the second try. Mrs. Valdez listened, nodded, and said only, "The desert gives back what you offer, if you wait longer than you want to." Near dusk, thunder muttered on the horizon. The air thickened. Even the dogs went silent. Evelyn stood on the porch, watching the clouds pile up like mountains made of worry. Colt appeared again, hat pushed low, eyes scanning the sky. "Monsoon teasing," he said. "It'll scare us half to death and leave nothing behind." "I know the feeling," she murmured. Had turned, puzzled. She only smiled and tucked a stray hair behind her ear. The first drop struck the rail like punctuation, then another. Then the rain gave up pretending and came all at once. They both laughed, surprised, almost young. She dashed to gather her slates. He caught the bucket before it floated away. When the downpour eased, he handed her a rag. Their fingers touched a brief, electric honesty neither could disguise. He stepped back quickly, wiping his own hands on his jeans as though cooling metal. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll help you build a roof for that school porch." "I thought you had shoes to make." "I've got time between soles," he answered, and was gone before she could decide whether he'd meant it as humor or confession. The rain left everything smelling new. Evelyn stood there until the last drip fell from the eaves, thinking that beginnings often arrive disguised as small errands, a bench, a chalk word, a promise made to the air. The next morning dawned, washed clean. the kind of light that makes even sorrow look newly painted. Every rooftop steamed. Children appeared early, tracking puddles, bringing questions about words they had dreamt. Evelyn met them with her sleeves rolled and her hair still damp from a hasty wash in the pump trough. They gathered beneath the makeshift awning. Colt had rigged a canvas stretched tight between two beams, rain still glimmering on the ropes. It wasn't a proper roof, but it was a promise pretending not to be. "Today," she said, "we'll spell after, because everything good comes after something hard." The children echoed her, awkward but brave, letters tumbling out of their mouths like small stones in a tin cup. Colt hammered in the distance, steady as punctuation. When one boy stumbled, Evelyn glanced toward the forge, and the rhythm there slowed, softened, then resumed, as if the hammer itself were offering patience. At midday, she carried bread across to the forge. Colt sat on an upturned bucket, wiping sweat with a rag already black with use. "For your trouble," she said. He tore a piece, chewed, swallowed. "For yours too," he said, handing the rest back. "Work tastes better shared." They ate in silence, companionable, the way two fires might warm the same night without competing for oxygen. Through the open door, she could see the half-finished benches stacked like intentions. "You don't owe me all this," she said. "I know," he answered. "But a thing worth existing deserves hands to build it." "Is that how you forgive yourself?" she asked quietly. He stopped wiping the rag, eyes fixed on nothing. "Some men go to church, some swing hammers. Either way, we're praying." The words hung between them, raw and honest. She wanted to ask what sins he thought required such prayers, but feared they might sound too much like her own. Instead, she said, "Then I suppose I teach for the same reason." He nodded once. "Looks like grace comes in more than one trade." A wind rose, carrying the smell of rain still trapped in the sage. The forge sighed. Colt stood, brushed his palms on his jeans, and said, "Come with me." They walked out past the edge of town where the land began again, open, red, unashamed. There, under the wide ache of sky, he had laid out a small rectangle of posts. "Schoolhouse," he said. "Only the ghost of it so far. But a ghost's a start." Evelyn stepped between the posts, turned slowly, imagining walls that weren't yet there. "You measured this yourself?" "With a soldier's eye and a sinner's hope," he said. "It's perfect," she whispered. He knelt to check a string line, spoke without looking up. "When I was a scout, they told us to build fires low, where the wind can't find them. But I figure learning should burn high enough to be seen from anywhere." "No." Her throat tightened. "You speak like a man who's lost and found things more than once." "I have," he said, still counting. They stood together until the light thinned. Then the children arrived, led by Mrs. Valdez, with a bucket of nails and no patience for hesitation. "If you two are done staring at miracles," she said, "we'll start hammering." The work became its own hymn. Colt measured, the boys fetched boards, the girls held steady what strength could not. Evelyn kept the rhythm by reading the alphabet aloud, one letter per nail. When she reached Z, the first wall stood upright, rough but proud. A cheer went up, ragged and real. The sound startled birds from the mesquite. Evelyn laughed until she cried. The tears ran down and met the dust, making tiny, stubborn pearls of mud. As twilight pooled in the corners, Colt leaned his hammer on his shoulder. "Tomorrow we set the bell frame," he said. "Every town deserves to wake on purpose." "Vous?" Evelyn nodded, unable to speak. The last light rimmed him in bronze, and she thought that if redemption had a shape, it would look something like this. A man who had turned regret into usefulness, a woman who had turned exile into calling, both standing inside the bones of something they were building together. Mrs. Valdez called the children home. The town folded itself into quiet. Evelyn lingered, tracing a fingertip along the rough grain of the wall. Colt watched her but said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence had already chosen its side. Night came. The stars were clean from rain. Somewhere a coyote rehearsed the same complaint every generation makes about being lonely and alive. The forge cooled slow. Evelyn sat on the porch steps, listening to the last faint ring from the anvil drift across the street. It sounded like a heartbeat that had finally learned to keep time with someone else's. She thought of Philadelphia and its marble schools, of the letter that had chased her west. She thought of the day's laughter, the calloused hands holding chalk, the children who had called her teacher without asking for proof. She realized she wasn't afraid of letters anymore, not the written kind, not the alphabet kind, not even the ones that carried her name. When she finally rose, the sky above the half-built school shimmered with heat lightning far away, a silent benediction. She smiled into it, feeling for the first time that her life no longer required translation. Before turning in, she whispered toward the dark, "Thank you." Whether it was meant for Colt, the town, or whatever merciful hand arranges such crossings, even she didn't know. And in the forge, unseen, Colt Ramirez lifted his head as if he'd heard. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second and tell us where you're watching from if you love stories of the last West town. The desert was quieter after the building began. It wasn't that the wind had stopped, only that it seemed to circle the new walls more carefully, as though respecting a newborn hush. By dawn, the beams cast long bars of shade across the red earth, and the smell of sawn pine drifted all the way to the forge. Evelyn woke before the Sunday habit now. She lit the small lamp, poured water from the clay pitcher, and washed the sleep from her face. In the mirror's warped glass, her reflection looked half stranger, half rooted woman. Somewhere between the two, she realized, lay the person she had been trying to become. Across the street, Colt's forge flared the town's first heartbeat each morning. She liked knowing he was already awake. It made her own rising feel less lonely. The hammer started its slow conversation with iron, a rhythm older than sermons. She smiled, pulled on her shawl, and stepped into the pale air that smelled faintly of mesquite smoke and rain remembered. At the school frame, she set her satchel down among the tools. The benches were finished, smooth pine, rubbed with oil until they gleamed like honey. She ran her fingers along one edge, thinking of the children's restless hands that would soon drum there. Behind her, boots scuffed the gravel. "Testing your craftsmanship again?" Colt's voice carried a grin. "I test what I depend on," she said, not turning yet. "You'll wear the polish off with all that touching. Then I'll know it was loved," she answered. He came to stand beside her, sleeves rolled, the morning light carving dust motes in the space between them. For a long moment, neither spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward anymore. It had become a kind of shared language. Finally, he said, "Roof's ready for shingles. I'll need someone light enough to walk the ridge with me." "Drain. Then you'd better find a lighter man," she said, arching an eyebrow. He shook his head. "I've already got a teacher who climbs her own ladders." She laughed, surprised at herself, and accepted the hand he offered. The wood underfoot creaked but held. From up there, the town looked smaller, its scatter of roofs, its single crooked street, the distant line of the dry river where coyotes drank dust. The sky, endless and pale, pressed down hard enough to make a soul confess. "Funny," she said, "how a little height changes everything." "Same land," Colt said. "Different mercy." They worked without talk for an hour, passing shingles and nails, the heat gathering on their shoulders. Once, when she lost balance, his arm caught her waist. For a heartbeat, she felt the strength in him steady, unhurried, and the old city fear of impropriety flared, only to melt beneath the honest grip that set her safely back. "Guess I still need learning," she murmured. "You're teaching me plenty," he said, voice low enough that the wind might claim it first. By noon, the roof was half done. They sat on the ridge eating bread and apples, legs dangling over opposite sides. The horizon shimmered. A hawk drifted high above, lazy as a held breath. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Every time the sun hits too hard," he said. "Then it goes down, and I remember I just have to chase it somewhere else." She nodded. "I used to believe movement was the same as change." He tossed the apple core into the sand. "Isn't it?" "Not always," she said. "Sometimes it's just running in place with prettier scenery." He smiled, eyes narrowing against the glare. "Maybe, but sometimes you have to run that circle before you know where the middle is." The simplicity of the thought disarmed her. Maybe that's all faith was, remembering the middle when everything else spins. They finished the meal in silence. Below, children's laughter began to echo the first group arriving early, eager to see what the grown-ups had built. Evelyn watched them race between the posts like colts newly freed, and something inside her settled. Work had a way of mending what prayers only promised. When the hammering resumed, townsfolk drifted over to help. Even Sheriff Bailey, gruff as ever, lifted a beam without complaint. Mrs. Valdez organized the children into a chorus of cheerleaders, their thin voices floating above the thuds of construction. By dusk, 4 walls and a roof stood firm, smelling of resin and sweat. Evelyn stayed until the last nail was driven. When the others left, she lingered in the doorway, tracing the grain of the threshold with her toe. Colt joined her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Looks different when it's finished," he said. "Looks possible," she replied. He nodded toward the mountains turning violet. "You'll need a name for it." She thought for a moment. "A schoolhouse doesn't need a name. The children will give it one." "Everything worth keeping earns a name," he said quietly. "Even the things we're afraid to speak." She turned to him then, caught by the gravity beneath the words. "And what would you call this?" she asked, gesturing not just to the building but to the space between them. He looked at her a long while, the dusk gathering in his eyes. "Something I don't want to lose," he said finally. Before she could reply, the first stars appeared, bright and premature. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture half good night, half confession, and walked toward the forge. The clang of his hammer returned a moment later, softer than usual, as if beating time to an unseen song. Evelyn stood until the desert cooled around her, the fresh pine scent mixing with iron and distant sage. She whispered each child's name under her breath, then added one more his, just to hear how it sounded in the night. By the time Sunday came, the church bell borrowed from the freight depot hung above the new schoolhouse. Colt had rigged it himself with an iron bracket so exact that even Reverend Harlan had to admit divine providence might favor good metalwork. The bell's first note rang at sunrise, bright and unsure, startling a flock of doves from the cottonwoods. The whole town gathered. They brought pies, quilts, and the kind of laughter that only appears after long waiting. Children lined up by height, fidgeting in clean shirts, stiff from too much starch. Evelyn stood at the doorway, hands folded before her, feeling the weight of eyes and expectation. Mrs. Valdez approached, cheeks flushed from the walk. "You'll need to say something, Maestra. It's your day." Evelyn shook her head, nerves tightening her chest. "It's their day," she said, glancing toward the children. Mrs. Valdez smiled. "Then tell them so." Colt appeared beside her, hat in hand, sleeves rolled despite the occasion. "You faced worse than a crowd," he murmured. She arched an eyebrow. "Have I?" He grinned. "A roof at noon, remember? That sun would have scared a preacher into hiding." His voice steadied her. When the Reverend finished his blessing, all eyes turned toward her. She stepped forward, the wood creaking under her boots. "This building," she began, "wasn't raised by one pair of hands. It was lifted by many, by those who believe the next generation should start higher than we did." The speeding. She looked over the small crowd, catching faces she'd come to know. Eliza Cooper with her ever-patient smile, Sheriff Bailey trying to look stern but blinking fast, the Valdez twins clutching each other's sleeves. "These walls hold more than lessons," she continued. "They hold your hope, and I promise to honor it." A hush followed. Then someone started to clap Tucker first. Of course, and soon the sound filled the air like rain. The children cheered, running into the schoolroom, their shoes thudding across the new floor. The bell rang again, loud and pure. Evelyn felt tears she hadn't expected press behind her eyes. She caught Colt's gaze. He nodded once, slow and proud, then turned to help the boys haul more benches inside. For a moment she allowed herself to simply watch him, the easy strength, the gentleness that lived beneath the calluses. The ceremony lasted most of the morning. When the crowd began to thin, she slipped away to the quiet back room that would serve as her office. A single window overlooked the arroyo. The light there was softer, filtered through the cottonwoods. She let herself breathe. That was when she saw the envelope. It lay atop her desk, plain brown, no name but hers in neat black ink, Miss Evelyn Carter. Her stomach tightened. The handwriting was Eastern, precise, the sort born of polished desks and expectations. She knew it before she even opened it. She read the letter once, then again, slower. Dear Miss Carter, the Board of Education in Philadelphia has reconsidered your petition for reinstatement. Given your years of service and the commendations from your previous headmaster, we are prepared to offer you a position effective September 1st, should you wish to return. Kindly telegraph your decision within 30 days. Your record will be fully restored upon acceptance. At the bottom, the signature she had both dreaded and longed for: Arthur Dempsey. The world outside the window blurred. The letter trembled slightly in her hands. A second chance, the city whispered, its marble halls and narrow certainties calling her home. But home, she realized with a start, wasn't a single place. It was the weight of people who waited for you to return. A soft knock broke her stillness. She folded the letter quickly, tucking it beneath a ledger. Colt leaned against the doorframe, hat dangling from 2 fingers. You disappeared, he said. Town's looking to toast the teacher. Just catching my breath, she said, forcing a smile. He studied her, the way a tracker studies dust for a story. Something wrong? No. The lie tasted dry. Just tired. He didn't believe her she could see it, but he let it rest. Come on, he said. They've got punch strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. She followed him outside. The sun was high now, and the celebration had turned ragged around the edges, children darting underfoot, men laughing too loud. Still, it was beautiful. A town reborn by its own stubbornness. When someone thrust a cup of punch into her hand, she took it, but her mind was far away in a city of spires, in a life already folded and stored. She heard Colt's laughter somewhere behind her, low and steady. She realized, with a kind of grief that felt like grace, that the letter had arrived too late. That evening, as the last guests left, she lingered again by the schoolhouse. The bell rope swayed in the night breeze. She reached up, let the frayed fibers run through her fingers. Every decision in her life seemed to have led to this quiet crossroad. Colt approached from the shadows, carrying a lantern. Didn't expect you'd stay behind. I like how it sounds after everyone's gone, she said. The silence feels earned. He held out the lantern. Then you should have some light for it. Ah. She accepted the flame, their fingers brushing. You ever think about your past, Colt? She asked suddenly. He chuckled. Every man does, if he's lived long enough to regret it. What was your name before Ramirez? He blinked. Why would you ask that? Because sometimes, she said softly, a person builds a new name to bury the old one. He exhaled, the lantern light catching the scar near his temple. I was born Caleb Remy. Changed it when I came west. Army clerk misspelled it once, and I let him. Figured a new name might make me someone worth keeping. And did it? Some days, he said. Other days, I think the old one's still riding a mile behind, waiting to catch up. Evelyn looked toward the unfinished fence line, where the land fell into darkness. Maybe we're all just trying to outrun our letters. Colt gave a low laugh. Guess that makes you faster than most. The words held warmth, but something in his eyes was distant, as though memory had pulled him backward. She wanted to reach out, to tell him about the letter in her desk, the choice she didn't know how to make, but she couldn't, not yet. Instead, she said, the children will hear that bell tomorrow. That's what matters tonight. He nodded. And you, Miss Carter, will be the one ringing it. She smiled faintly. You'll hear it from the forge. I'll be listening, he said. They parted with a quiet goodnight that felt heavier than usual. When she returned to her room, she took out the letter again, read it once more by lamplight. Then she folded it carefully and placed it between the pages of her journal, where it could sleep beside all the other lives she'd once almost lived. Outside, the bell rope moved on its own, whispering across the beam like a restless thought. Somewhere, in the forge across the street, Colt Ramirez hammered late into the night, not shaping iron now, but trying, perhaps, to shape silence. The week that followed was windswept and restless. Each morning, Evelyn rang the bell at sunrise, the sound cutting through the canyon like a vow. Children arrived sleepy and smiling, their boots trailing dust, their laughter stitching the day together. By afternoon, she could almost forget the folded letter in her journal. Almost. But every night, when the lamp burned low and the air cooled enough to smell of sage. The weight of that sealed promise returned. The city still whispered to her soft, insistent, like a ghost asking to be remembered. On Thursday, the wind shifted. A storm brewed far off, thunder walking across the horizon. She dismissed class early and stood outside the schoolhouse as the last child vanished down the road. The air felt charged, the way it does before change. Colt appeared, leading his gray horse by the reins, hair tousled by the gust. "Storm's coming from the south," he said. "Best bar the shutters." She smiled faintly. "I can handle a little weather." "It's not the weather I'm worried about," he said, eyes tracing the letter she was still clutching before she realized it had slipped from her satchel. She froze. "You were right," she admitted softly. "Something's been wrong." "Load?" He didn't move closer, just waited the kind of patience that comes from long hours with horses and fire. She held out the letter, unable to say the words. He read it in silence. When he finished, he folded it once and handed it back. "So that's what's been riding you," he said. "It's everything I used to want," she murmured. "Used to," he repeated, testing the words. "So what do you want now?" The wind whipped her skirt against her legs, tugged hair from her braid. "I don't know," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. He stepped closer. "Then I'll tell you what I see. You built something here. Not just wood and nails. You gave this town a reason to wake up early." Her throat tightened. "And what about you, Colt Ramirez, or Caleb Remy, whichever name belongs to the man talking to me now? What reason wakes you?" He smiled sadly. "Used to be revenge. Then survival. Lately, it's been you ringing that bell every morning." Then, lightning flickered behind him, painting the desert in brief, silver bones. She felt the ache of something too large to hold. "Don't say things like that," she whispered. "Why not?" he asked. "They're true. Because truth makes everything harder." He tilted his head. "Only if you still plan on leaving." The wind carried the smell of rain, sharp and clean. She looked down at the letter, at the neat signature that had once dictated her life. "Philadelphia feels like another planet now," she said. "But I can't keep running from myself, Colt." He studied her for a moment. "Maybe you're not running. Maybe you're finally stopping." The first drops fell large, cold, certain. He reached for her hand, rough palm against soft fingers. "Let it rain," he said quietly. "You don't have to decide tonight." But she already had. The decision wasn't a thought, it was a pulse. Something ancient and sure. She leaned into him as the rain came harder, washing dust from the rooftops, blurring the horizon. When they finally pulled apart, both drenched, she laughed through tears. "You'll catch cold." He brushed her hair back. "Not likely. I've weathered worse." They took shelter in the schoolhouse, the storm roaring overhead like an old god clearing its throat. Inside, lantern light threw gold against the new walls. She shivered. He draped his coat around her shoulders. For a long time, they just listened to the rain, to the steady tick of drops on tin. Words would have spoiled it. Only when the thunder rolled farther away did she speak. "Colt," she said, voice trembling. "When you changed your name, did you miss the man you left behind?" He thought about it, tracing circles on the table with one finger. "Sometimes," he said, "but mostly, I missed believing he could still be forgiven." "Do you think he can?" He met her eyes. "Depends who's doing the forgiving." The air felt thick between them, as if every unsaid thing hovered there waiting. She reached into her satchel, pulled out the letter, and fed it to the lantern flame. The paper curled, edges glowing before turning to ash. "There," she said. "Consider him forgiven." For a moment, neither spoke. The storm faded to a drizzle. Outside, the bell rope swayed gently, tapping the side of the frame like a heartbeat. Colt stood, moved to the door. "You sure about this?" She nodded. "I'm sure about staying." He looked as if he wanted to say more, but instead, he offered a small, almost reverent smile. "Then I reckon this town just found its soul." She followed him outside. The clouds were breaking apart, letting moonlight spill over the wet earth. The smell of rain and smoke hung heavy, the kind that clings to skin and memory. "Tomorrow," she said, "the children will ask why the bell sounds different. Of Lua. What will you tell them? That storm's changed the tone of everything they touch." He laughed softly. "Guess we'll find out if that's true." They stood side by side in the cooling air. Her hand brushed his again, deliberate this time. He didn't pull away. The forge's coals still glowed faintly across the street, a red eye refusing to sleep. When she finally turned to go, he called after her, voice low. "Evelyn." She looked back. "Yes? If you ever need reminding why you stayed, come to the forge. I'll tell you again." She smiled, the kind that holds tears behind it. "Then you'd better keep the fire burning." The next morning, when the sun rose clear and merciless over Dusthaven, the bell rang once more. The tone was deeper, richer, as if it remembered the storm that had baptized it. Children came running, shouting her name. She met them at the door with a smile that felt lighter than air. Across the street, Colt paused mid-swing of his hammer, listening. The sound drifted over the anvil, sweet, solemn, full of beginnings. He smiled to himself and kept working, each strike a promise. The monsoon had washed the world clean, but the desert never stayed washed for long. Within a week, the sun had baked the mud back into dust, and the smell of rain was only a rumor caught in the sage. Life, like the West, moved on before anyone could decide whether it should. The children returned to their lessons. Evelyn taught beneath the open window, chalk dust catching light like a halo around her hands. Outside, the blacksmith's hammer sounded its faithful rhythm, each strike reminding her that the world still had good bones. Sometimes she would pause mid-lesson, pretending to adjust a slate, just to listen. The ring of iron and her voice reading the alphabet had become a strange duet, two languages spelling the same word, home. By late afternoon, the heat turned lazy. The students drifted off with lessons still half finished, but their laughter stayed, echoing down the dirt road. Evelyn remained behind, wiping the board clean, humming a tune she couldn't name. When she heard boots at the doorway, she didn't need to turn. "You walk heavy when you're worried," she said. Colt leaned against the frame, wiping sweat from his brow. "Then I must be a thunderstorm." She smiled faintly. "What's chasing you?" "News," he said, "the kind that rides faster than sense." He stepped inside, dust swirling around his boots. "A man came through town last night, Pinkerton badge, Philadelphia tongue. Asked about a teacher by the name of Evelyn Carter." The eraser slipped from her fingers. "Did you tell him anything?" "I told him you were teaching children to spell freedom, and that seemed dangerous enough." Her voice trembled. "Did he say what he wanted?" "He didn't have to. Said something about a missing fund from the city schools, a ledger that vanished the same week you left. I told him we don't keep ledgers out here, just debts and promises." She looked away, hands tightening at her sides. "There was no missing fund. There was a lie. Someone forged my name on a bank withdrawal, and the board wanted a scapegoat." Colt nodded slowly. "Then he's here to drag a lie across state lines." "He won't find me guilty," she said, but her voice betrayed the sliver of fear that still lived in her. "He might not need to," Colt said softly. "All he needs is someone who looks like guilt." The air between them felt tight, the way it does when a storm decides it isn't finished after all. She steadied herself. "I can face him. I've spent too many years running from what isn't true." Colt studied her for a long moment. "Then you won't face him alone." She shook her head. "This isn't your fight. Neither was saving you from that wrecked coach," he said. "But here we are." She wanted to argue, but the conviction in his tone quieted her. There was something unyielding about him, a kind of moral gravity that kept everyone else from drifting too far. Outside, the wind began to rise. The sky darkened at the edges. Dusthaven always wore its name honestly. That night, the Pinkerton agent arrived at the boarding house just as the lamps were being lit. He was tall, narrow, polished, a man carved from rules and ink. The badge on his vest caught every stray light. "Miss Evelyn Carter," he said. "Philadelphia's been trying to find you." Mrs. Valdez stiffened at the counter. "She's not hiding," she said. "Then she won't mind talking." Evelyn stepped down the stairs, spine straight, voice calm. "I don't mind at all." The agent smiled, not kindly. "Good. You can clear this up quick. We've got reason to believe you carried off a ledger belonging to the Academy Board. It was never recovered." "Because I never took it." He unfolded a sheet of paper. "Signature says otherwise." She stared at the scrawl at the bottom. The handwriting looked like hers, almost too much like hers. "That's not mine. That's what every thief says, ma'am." Before she could reply, the door swung open. Colt stepped inside, silent and steady as a coming tide. His shirt was still streaked with soot from the forge, and the air around him smelled faintly of steel and smoke. "Something wrong?" he asked, eyes fixed on the agent. "This is Pinkerton business," the man said. "You're not needed." Colt took one slow step closer. "I make horseshoes, not judgments, but I don't like men calling my friends liars in my town." The agent adjusted his collar. "You'd do well to remember who holds the law here." "I remember fine," Colt said. "But out here, law still answers to decency." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Evelyn laid a hand on Colt's arm. "It's all right," she said quietly. "Let him finish." "Ugh." The agent's voice softened, almost pitying. "If you come back with me, Miss Carter, this can all be settled. You'll get a fair hearing." Evelyn met his gaze. "Fairness isn't something that travels well west of the Mississippi. I'll stay where the truth's already growing." He frowned. "That's your final word?" "It is." "Then I'll bring men who can change your mind." He turned to leave. Colt's voice stopped him. "Next time you ride in here, you come with a warrant, not threats. Love." The agent looked him up and down, smirked. "And you'd be what? Her protector? Just a man who knows how to stand where he's needed." The Pinkertons' boots clicked out into the night. The sound lingered even after the door shut. Evelyn's breath came shaky. "He'll be back." "I know," Colt said. "And if he brings the law, then the law can learn where justice sleeps," he said. And for the first time since she'd known him, she heard anger in his voice. Not the kind that shouts, but the kind that burns clean. She reached out, touched his hand. "You could leave, Colt. You don't owe me anything." He looked at her then, and there was something almost holy in the steadiness of his gaze. "You gave this town a reason to wake up," he said. "If I walk away now, I'd be the one asleep." Outside, the first dusk gusts swept through the street, rattling the shutters like bones. Somewhere far off, thunder cracked again. The storm, it seemed, wasn't done with Dusthaven. The next morning broke strange, a copper-colored dawn that made the sky look half forged, half bleeding. The wind carried that brittle silence that always means trouble is already riding. Dogs barked, then fell quiet. Even the forge seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn stood at the schoolhouse window, pretending to arrange slates, though she'd been watching the road for an hour. The dust plume appeared right on time, 4 riders moving in a diamond pattern, the one in front tall, stiff-backed, hat brim sharp enough to cut shadow. The Pinkerton was keeping his word. Across the street, Colt stepped out of the forge, hands black with soot, shirt half-buttoned, eyes calm, in a way that made calm itself seem dangerous. He watched the riders without blinking. Blue smoke shifted under him, reading his tension like scripture. The first rider dismounted the same agent from last night. His voice carried the smug polish of authority. "Morning, Mr. Ramirez. We'll be needing the lady." Colt wiped his hands on a rag, folded it slow. "You're early. Town court doesn't open till never." The agent's jaw twitched. "This isn't a request." "Oh, then you'd better come proper," Colt said, "with a name on paper and a seal that ain't self-made." Behind him, Evelyn came down the porch steps. The children had been sent home already, only the wind listened now. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. "If you want to question me, you can do it here." The Pinkerton looked from her to Colt, then to the few townsfolk gathering at a distance, Mrs. Valdez at her doorway, Sheriff Bailey pretending to polish his rifle but not interfering. "Out here," the agent said, "law's what a man can enforce." Colt's eyes narrowed. "Maybe back east. Out here, law's what a man can live with after." The agent's hand hovered near his coat, not quite touching metal, just brushing against the hint of it. Colt saw it, shifted his stance just enough to show he'd seen it, and the air went taut as a drawn bowstring. "You really want to test that theory?" Colt asked, voice low. The other riders dismounted, boots crunching on gravel. Dusthaven's main street held its breath. Evelyn took one step forward, between them. "Stop," she said softly. "You came for the truth, so hear it. I didn't steal your ledger. The headmaster did. His assistant forged my name because I refused him. When the scandal broke, they buried me to keep the Academy's name clean." The agent laughed, but it cracked around the edges. "You expect me to believe that without proof?" "Proof's buried in Philadelphia," she said, "but truth's still breathing here." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Colt took a slow step forward, placing himself half a stride in front of her, not blocking her. Exactly. But standing as if to give the world fair warning. "You heard the lady," he said. "And since you're new in these parts, I'll tell you how this works. We settle lies with daylight, not guns." The agent's lip curled. "And if daylight doesn't scare you, then maybe you haven't seen enough of it." Huh. Thunder rolled low behind them, too far to matter yet, but close enough to be heard. A tumbleweed broke free, rolled through the standoff like a nervous spectator. The other riders shifted, uncertain. Colt's stillness unnerved them more than any weapon could have. Evelyn's heart hammered. Every breath felt borrowed. Yet when she looked at Colt, she saw no fear, only conviction carved into flesh. He was a man built to withstand weather, even when the weather came wearing a badge. Finally, the Pinkerton exhaled. "You've got a mouth on you, Ramirez." "Better than an empty head," Colt replied, smiling thin. "You'll find the trail back east smoother if you turn around now." The agent weighed it, pride versus prudence. He looked again at the small circle of faces watching from porches. The widow, the sheriff, the children peeking behind the church fence. The town had chosen a side, quietly but completely. He spat once into the dust. "Ain't worth the paperwork," he said, jerking his reins. "But the city won't forget this." Colt nodded once. "Neither will we." The Pinkerton swung into the saddle. His men followed, the sound of hooves fading into the canyon. When they were gone, the town exhaled as if waking from prayer. Evelyn's knees almost gave. Colt caught her elbow before she could fall. "Easy now," he said. She steadied, swallowed hard. "You shouldn't have done that." He met her eyes. "And let them write your story for you? Not my style." She managed a laugh that turned into a sob. "You're impossible. Only on days ending with ye," he said, soft enough that the wind could have claimed it. She pressed a hand against her chest, feeling her heartbeat racing to catch up with courage. "You risked everything." Colt looked toward the horizon where the riders had vanished. "Not everything," he said. "Just what's mine to risk. Zero." The first raindrop fell, darkening the brim of his hat. "Seems we called the weather again," he murmured. "Every storm we face," she said. "You're standing in it. Wouldn't look right otherwise." They stood together as the sky split open, lightning slicing behind the mountains, thunder tumbling after. Rain sheeted down, quick and fierce. Colt's hand found hers. She didn't pull away. For a few moments, there was nothing but the sound of water striking tin, dust turning to clay, and two people who had already decided too much to ever go back. When the rain softened, Evelyn turned to him. "What happens now?" He smiled, small and tired. "Now we build again. Dust never quits, neither do we." She looked up at the sky, streaked with lightning like scripture. "Then let it rain as long as it needs." Oh. By the time the storm thinned to a silver drizzle, Dusthaven had turned quiet again. The air smelled of wet mesquite and iron. Puddles mirrored a sky still trembling with leftover thunder. Evelyn and Colt walked side by side down the muddy street, boots sinking softly, the town's calm slowly returning around them. Sheriff Bailey tipped his hat as they passed. "Guess the Pinkertons figured this place ain't worth the trouble." Colt gave a faint smile. They were right for once. And for. Inside the schoolhouse, the lantern light flickered over the chalk dust haze. Desks sat in neat rows like patient witnesses. Evelyn set her shawl on the chair, wringing rain from its edge. Her hands still trembled. "You shouldn't have faced them alone," she said. Colt leaned in the doorway. "Wasn't alone. Whole town stood behind you. Because of you." He shook his head. "Because they finally saw who you are." She looked around the room, the maps curling on the walls, the small slate drawings left by her pupils, and felt the fragile line between safety and exile dissolve. "I don't know if I can stay after this," she whispered. "They'll come back, or send letters, or worse." "Then we'll send answers," Colt replied. "Truth's a harder bullet than any they carry." For a long time she said nothing. Then she laughed softly. You always sound like the end of a sermon. Imes? Maybe I just like the sound of belief. He crossed the floor until only a breath separated them. Rain drummed on the roof like a heartbeat. Evelyn, he said quietly, you don't owe me thanks. Just don't run from what's already yours. Her throat tightened. And what's that? He took her hand, rough palm against her ink-stained fingers. A life that finally fits. Outside, the clouds broke apart, and thin sun spilled through, catching the motes of chalk floating in the air. The light fell across their joined hands, two survivors stitched together by defiance and something dangerously like love. When he left, the street gleamed clean, the sign above the forge dripping slow rivulets of light. Evelyn watched him go, realizing the town was no longer a place she passed through. It had claimed her, just as he had, quietly, irrevocably. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters and their stories from Dusthaven and beyond. The morning after the storm dawned clear, washed clean of dust and doubt. The desert stretched wide and shimmering, as if the earth itself had exhaled. Colt was already at the forge when Evelyn arrived, her skirt hem damp from the puddles that lingered in the shade. He looked up from the anvil, a faint smile tracing his mouth. Didn't think school kept early hours after a showdown. She smiled back. Lessons wait for no legend. He chuckled, hammer lowering. Guess I'll need to behave then. Don't want the kids thinking their blacksmith's a gunfighter. They already think that, she said. But they also think he's a hero. Colt set the hammer down. Heroes don't always come out clean, Evelyn. Neither do teachers, she said softly. We just keep showing up. For a moment, silence settled between them, the good kind, heavy with understanding. She watched the firelight glint across the edge of metal, the same way sunlight had caught his eyes when he'd faced the Pinkertons. The thought still made her heart trip. Colt, she said, what if they send someone else? A man with papers, real authority. Then I'll read the fine print, he replied. Maybe add my own signature underneath. You can't fight the world forever. Who said anything about fightin'? I'm just stayin' put. That simple statement carried the weight of an oath. She realized then that this town, this unlikely speck of stubborn life, had already rewritten both of them. By midday, the heat returned. The street steamed gently, smelling of sun and iron. Evelyn dismissed her class early and found herself walking without thinking, past the livery, the church, the ridge beyond the well. The land glittered with moisture like a new forged coin. Halfway up the ridge, she stopped. The horizon was vast and cruelly beautiful. She thought of the life she'd left behind, the academy halls, the marble corridors, the endless scrutiny. That world had measured worth in reputation and etiquette. This one measured it in how you stood when wind and rumor hit at once. A shadow joined hers. Colt had followed, quiet as always. Didn't mean to interrupt, he said. You didn't, she replied. Just needed to see where the world begins. Funny, he said, gazing at the same horizon. I always thought it begins wherever someone decides to stop running. And to it. They stood together a while, the silence full of small sounds, a hawk's cry, the hiss of wind through dry grass. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than she felt. I'm not running anymore. I know, he said simply. You belong here. Do I? He nodded. Dusthaven's stubborn. So are you. That's kinship enough. That evening, the town gathered by the half-rebuilt church. Bailey announced that the council had voted to make Evelyn the permanent teacher unanimous. Loud cheers all around. Someone brought whiskey. Someone else brought pie. The fiddler struck a tune that wove through laughter and clinking glasses. Evelyn found herself dancing again, barefoot this time, skirts swirling through candlelight. Colt joined her, hesitant at first, then easy, his calloused hand finding hers. Around them, the townsfolk clapped in time. The music rose, fell, rose again. When the song ended, Colt drew her aside toward the steps. Town wants a wedding come spring, he said, half smiling. Evelyn laughed. Does the bride know? Figured she might, if I ask proper. And if she says no, he shrugged. Then I'll just have to keep trying till she forgets how to refuse. Winter slipped into Dusthaven like a slow breath, softening the edges of everything it touched. The storms had passed, the river shrank to a silver thread, and the nights grew sharp enough to make lantern glass crack. The forge glowed late each evening. The schoolhouse windows shone like amber against the frost. Evelyn had grown used to the rhythm. Children's laughter in the morning, hammer strikes echoing through town by noon, and that slow drawl of conversation whenever she crossed paths with Colt on her walk home. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't, but always there was that steady hum between them like heat still hidden in cooling coals. On Christmas Eve, the town gathered around the saloon porch. The sheriff read from the good book. Mrs. Valdez led a hymn that drifted up into the cold stars. When the candles guttered low, Colt appeared beside Evelyn, his breath clouding the air. "Got something for you," he said, pressing a small wrapped parcel into her hands. She untied the string carefully. Inside lay a tiny silver pendant shaped like a quill. The metal was rough but beautiful. "I made it," Colt said quietly. "Figured every teacher deserves her weapon." Evelyn traced the lines of it, speechless. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Thank you." He smiled, eyes shadowed and soft. "You once told me you came here to start over. Guess I did too." She looked at him, then the same man who had once faced down the law for her, who now forged iron for plows and door hinges instead of defense. "You've built more than that," she said. "You've built a place people can believe in." The fiddler struck up a tune. Around them, the town danced, their laughter echoing into the cold. Colt held out a hand. "Dance with me." Evelyn hesitated only a second before placing her hand in his. They moved slowly, the music fading until all that remained was the sound of boots against wood and the whisper of fabric brushing together. The desert wind sighed through the streets like an old friend. When the song ended, Colt didn't let go. "Evelyn," he said softly, "the forge needs another set of hands. The school needs another set of eyes. Maybe the town needs a family to remind it what home looks like." She met his gaze. "Is that your way of asking?" "Seems so," he said, a hint of nervousness breaking through his usual calm. Evelyn smiled, the kind that starts slow and ends in certainty. "Then I suppose my answer better match the place we live, honest and a little stubborn." "Yes?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Colt Ramirez." The cheer that followed might have woken the whole desert. Mrs. Valdez shouted a prayer of thanks. Sheriff Bailey fired his revolver once into the air, just to mark the occasion. The echo rolled away across the hills like a promise delivered. By dawn, the celebration had dwindled to laughter and tired music. Evelyn walked with Colt to the edge of town, the horizon pale and waiting. "When I first came here," she said, "I thought Dusthaven was a place to survive. Now I think it's a place to live." Colt squeezed her hand. "Reckon it's both. You just needed to meet the right fool to prove it." She laughed softly. "If you're a fool, you're the kind that saves people." And if you're a teacher," he replied, "you're the kind that makes 'em worth savin'." The first sunlight spilled across the desert, painting the sand gold. They stood together and watched it rise, two souls stitched by wind, work, and quiet devotion. A year passed, quiet and fierce as the desert wind itself. By the following spring, Dusthaven had changed in ways only patient eyes could see. The forge had doubled in size. The schoolhouse wore a new bell that caught the sunrise like a coin. Children ran the length of Main Street without fear, their shouts scattering the red-winged blackbirds from the cottonwoods. Evelyn Ramirez still rose before dawn. She swept the classroom, trimmed the lantern wicks, and watched the morning light turn the chalkboard silver. Outside, she could already hear Colt's hammers singing at the forge, steady, deliberate, content. That rhythm had become the heartbeat of the town, a reassurance that everything solid and decent still held. At midday, she walked out with a basket of bread and coffee. Colt met her halfway, wiping his brow with a rag darkened by soot. "Kids behavin'?" he asked. "Mostly," she said, "though Tommy Hale still thinks arithmetic is witchcraft." He grinned. "Then you're a fine witch to keep him under your spell." They sat on the bench outside the forge, eating in companionable silence. Beyond the roofs of the town, the desert rippled gold and white under the heat. A hawk circled lazily above. Evelyn leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed. "Hard to believe I once thought this was the end of the world." Colt looked out across the dust. "Maybe it is," he said, "but it's the kind worth livin' at the edge of." When afternoon came, they rode beyond the ridge where the first storm had caught them a year ago. The place looked different now, grass pushing through the old wagon ruts, mesquite in bloom, bees fussing in the air. Evelyn dismounted and stood where the overturned wagon had once been. "Feel smaller than I remember," she said. "That's 'cause you got bigger," Colt answered. "World shrinks for folks who finally fit inside it." He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a folded sheet of paper. "Been meaning to show you this. Sheriff Bailey had it brought from Tucson." "Oh." She unfolded it carefully. "The Territorial Council hereby recognizes Dust Haven School as an official institution of learning, with Miss Evelyn Ramirez as headmistress." Her breath caught. "We're official." "Reckon so," Colt said, proud. "Guess that makes you the law of learning now." Evelyn laughed a sound the wind seemed to carry straight into the hills. "Who'd have thought I'd end up a headmistress in the middle of nowhere?" Colt tipped his hat. "Everywhere's the middle of nowhere till someone builds something that lasts." They lingered there until dusk. The sun melted behind the buttes, painting the horizon copper. Evelyn rested her head on his shoulder. "We've come a long way from that wagon." "Long way yet to go," he said. "But the trail's ours now." The first stars blinked to life above the cooling land. The wind carried the smell of sage and forge smoke, a blend of wild and home. In the distance, the bell of the schoolhouse rang once, clear and bright, as if the town itself were taking a breath. "If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of the last West town. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." Cowboy love stories. Wild West love. Wild West stories, they live because you listen, and because every road home begins with a little dust and a lot of heart. A mail-order bride was left at the station until a broken man found redemption in her baby's cry. The dust swirled in a relentless, choking cloud around Eleanor Vance's ankles as she stepped down from the stagecoach. It wasn't the genteel, golden dust of her New Orleans memories, but a coarse, angry red grit that coated her traveling dress and stung her eyes. The driver flicked his reins, the horses stamped, and the coachman's weary call, "Redwood Springs," fell dead against a town that seemed to listen only to itself. The oppressive silence, broken by the mournful creak of a windmill and the impatient snorts of the team, felt more menacing than the clamor of any city street. A small 6-year-old hand, clammy with fear, clutched hers. "Mama, where are we?" Josephine whispered, her voice a fragile thing against the wide, unforgiving sky. "Where we start again," Eleanor said, trying to make the words steady enough to carry. She tasted the lie, thin as paper, bitter as old coffee. The truth was uglier. A ledger full of a dead man's promises. A seal pressed into wax like a bootprint on a throat. A home dangled like a carrot and snatched away by the same hand that offered it. She had not come west to start again. She had been chased. The town itself was a testament to its master. Every painted board seemed scabbed with a crude claim. "Property of S. Thorne." The sign above the saloon door had been repainted so many times the letters had a raised scar to them. Even the air felt like it belonged to him, heavy, impatient, collecting debts. The bank's door swung open, and with it came the sharp smell of ink and stale cigar smoke. A man stepped out in a too fine suit, already losing its war with the dust. His face was a roadmap of hard bargains, his eyes winter cold. He saw her the way a rancher sees a scrawny calf at auction. Weight, worth, trouble. Silas Thorne. A lazy, predatory grin crawled over his mouth. "Well, well, look what the wind blew in." His voice had gravel in it, and so did his smile. "The lovely Mrs. Vance, I didn't think you had the backbone to show." Eleanor drew Josephine behind her skirts and lifted her chin. "Mr. Thorne," she began, and the tremor in her voice made her furious with herself. "I've come to appeal to your reason. My husband's debt wasn't mine. And the house." "Reason?" He laughed, but there wasn't any humor in it. "Reason left these parts with the last spring rain. Your husband was a fool. He bet on a phantom vein and lost. Now the bill is yours. That's how ink works." He reached a hand toward Josephine's cheek, casual as you please, and caught a palm across his knuckles for the effort. "Don't touch her," Eleanor hissed. Silas looked down at the red mark, amused. "Feisty. I like feisty. It burns hot and quick." He leaned in until she could count the pockmarks along his jaw. "The land is mine. The house. I might be persuaded to let you keep a roof if the right papers are signed." His breath was whiskey and rot. "I can be generous to you and your little secret." The word he didn't say was louder than the one he did. Bastard. The sound of it rippled through the empty street, as if the boards themselves were listening. "I'd rather burn my home to the ground," Eleanor said, voice shaking but true, "than stake it on your charity." Silas's smile never reached his eyes. "Have it your way. You've got till sundown to get your saint's answer together. Try to run, and the desert will deliver you back to my door, dry as parchment." He touched his hat brim, not in courtesy but possession, and strolled off toward the saloon, two men peeling off the shade to follow him like flies. Silence pressed in. The stagecoach rattled away. Eleanor stood in the empty street with a child, a trunk, and a heart too tired to carry itself. Tears came hot and uninvited, tracing dusty tracks. Josephine began to whimper, and Eleanor scooped her close, breathing her in soap and travel and the ghost of oranges from the station in San Antonio. The sun lowered, and the sky caught fire. Along the eastern road, a lone rider cut against the light, horse and hat and rifle slung easy, the silhouette of a man who'd been out where law thins to rumor. He slowed at the edge of town, watching the tableau. A woman, a child, a trunk, and the kind of quiet that screams. Kane Colton swung down, boots kissing dirt, spurs giving a restrained jingle that somehow didn't feel like swagger. "Ma'am," he said, voice low and even the kind of voice you hand a bleeding day to. "You in some kind of trouble?" A dozen answers jostled in Eleanor's throat. She settled for the truest one. She gestured toward the bank, toward the town, toward all of it. "I've been left with nothing," she said. "My husband's debts, they sold them to a man who wants to sell me." Kane's jaw ticked, a small flash of iron beneath gentleness. He knew the name without asking. Thorn's kind had a smell to them that lawmen learned early. He looked at Eleanor's gloved hands, fine but work-worn, a lady who'd learned to be her own maid. He looked at Josephine, big eyes, tired shoulders. Children keep score with their bodies. Then he did what men like him do when a wrong looks back at them. "Name's Kane Colton. I'm the marshal," he said, as if that was a promise rather than a title. He held out his hand, the palm was calloused, the grip unthreatening. Eleanor hesitated a heartbeat, and took it. Warmth bled across, and steadied her just enough that she noticed the limp, a small hitch, worn smooth by years, that he covered with grace. War or horse, she thought, or both. "Where's your trunk?" he asked. "Here." She tried to lift a corner and nearly folded. Kane took Josephine first, gentle as a secret, then shouldered the trunk like a fault you decide to bear. The child went quiet against his chest almost instantly, listening to the drum of a heart that didn't race under pressure. "I can't pay for a room," Eleanor said as he steered them toward the boarding house, the shame rising like fever. "We'll talk to Mrs. Peterson," Kane said. "She's got a spine like a church beam and a heart to match." The way he said it made refusal feel ridiculous. The boarding house was a clapboard rectangle with flower boxes that had lived and died and lived again. Mrs. Peterson herself filled the doorway like a hymn. "Marshal," she said, taking in the scene with eyes that missed nothing. "Bring them in." Eleanor's room was small, clean, and the kind of quiet you can sleep inside. The bed sagged in the middle, as if it, too, had carried a lot of stories. Kane set the trunk down, shifted Josephine back to her mother with reluctant care, and tipped his hat to leave. In the hall, Eleanor heard him speak in the murmur men use when they're spending money that matters to them. "I'll cover it," he told Mrs. Peterson. "For now." It isn't charity," he said when Eleanor followed him out to protest. He watched her, really watched her, the way you study a sky for weather. "It's the right thing. For tonight, let that be enough." The right thing. The words loosened something knotted behind her ribs. She bowed her head, and for a second, just breathed. That night, Josephine slept like the dead do, And Eleanor, a woman who had learned to sleep with one ear open and one hand on a latch, slept in ragged loops, pulled up by dreams that were more memory than fear. In one, New Orleans rain, curtains breathing in and out, her husband's voice warm with promises and cold with lies. In another, the letter, big seal, bigger threat. In all of them, a door closing softly, final. Near dawn, she woke with the sense of being stared at, and found only the window looking back. The sky was a pale wound. She washed in cold water and